I was sick. Sick unto death with that long agony. I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last of distinct accentuation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of the inquisitorial voices seemed merged in one dreamy, indeterminate hum. Then my vision fell upon the tall candles upon the table. At first, they wore the aspect of charity and seemed white, slender angels who would save me. But then, all at once, the angel forms became meaningless specters with heads of flame. And I saw that from them there would be no help. Death. And then there stole into my fancy, like a rich, musical note, the thought of what sweet rest there must be in the grave. The thought came gently and stealthily, but just as my spirit came at length properly to feel and entertain it, the blackness of darkness supervened. All sensation appeared swallowed up in a mad, rushing descent as if the soul into hell. That silence and stillness and night were the universe. Death. Very suddenly, there came back to my soul motion and sound. The tumultuous motion of the heart, and in my ears the sound of its beating. So far, I had not opened my eyes. I longed, yet dared not to employ my vision. I dreaded the first glance at objects around me. It was not that I feared to look upon things horrible, but that I grew aghast lest there should be nothing to see. At length, with a wild desperation at heart, I quickly opened my eyes. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. My worst thoughts then were confirmed. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. The atmosphere was intolerably close. I thrust my arms wildly above and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet dreaded to move a step lest I should be impeded by the walls of a tomb. The agony of suspense grew at length intolerable, and I cautiously moved forward with my arms extended and my eyes straining from their sockets in the hope of catching some faint ray of light. I proceeded for many paces, but still all was blackness and vacancy. As I continued to step cautiously onward, there came thronging upon my recollection 1,000 vague rumors of the horrors of the Inquisition. Of the dungeons there had been strange things narrated. Fables I had always deemed them, but yet strange and too ghastly to repeat save in a whisper. My outstretched hands at length encountered some solid obstruction. It was a wall, very smooth, slimy, and cold. I followed it up, stepping with all the careful distrust with which certain antique narratives had inspired me. This process, however, afforded me no means of ascertaining the dimensions of my dungeon, as I might make its circuit and return to the point where I set out without being aware of the fact. So perfectly uniform seemed the wall. Quitting the wall, I resolved to cross the area of the enclosure. 3, 4, 5, 6. I had advanced some 10 or 12 paces in this manner when the torn hem of my robe became entangled between my legs. I stepped on it and fell violently on my face. In the confusion attending my fall, I did not immediately apprehend a somewhat startling circumstance. My chin rested upon the floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my head touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and the peculiar smell of decayed fungus arose to my nostrils. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds, I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me. Another step before my fall, and the world had seen me no more. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, resolving there to perish rather than risk the terrors of the well. In other conditions of mind, I might have had courage to end my misery at once by a plunge into the abyss. But now, I was the veriest of cowards. Neither could I forget what I had read of the pit, that the sudden extinction of life formed no part of its most horrible plan. A deep sleep fell upon me. A sleep like that of death. When once again I opened my eyes, the objects around me were visible, and I was able to see the extent and aspect of my dungeon. Its general shape was square. What I had taken for masonry seemed now to be iron in huge plates. The floor was of stone. In the center yawned the circular pit from whose jaws I had escaped. All this I saw indistinctly and by much effort, for my personal condition had been greatly changed during slumber. I now lay upon my back on a low framework of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long strap, which passed in many convolutions about my limbs and body, leaving at liberty only my head and left arm to such extent that I could supply myself with food from an earthen dish which lay by my side on the floor. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. In one of its panels was the painted figure of Time, as he is commonly represented. Save that, instead of a scythe, he held what I supposed to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as we see on antique clocks. While I gazed directly upward at it, I fancied that I saw it in motion. In an instant afterward, the fancy was confirmed. Its sweep was brief, and of course, slow. I watched it for some minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. A slight noise attracted my notice, and looking to the floor, I saw several enormous rats traversing it. They had issued from the well, allured by the scent of the meat. From this, it required much effort and attention to scare them away. It might have been half an hour, perhaps even an hour, before I again cast my eyes upward. What I then saw confounded and amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in extent by nearly a yard. As a natural consequence, its velocity was also much greater. But what mainly disturbed me was the idea that it had perceptibly descended. I now observed, with what horror it is needless to say, that its nether extremity was formed of a crescent of glittering steel, and the under edge as keen as that of a razor. Like a razor also, it seemed massy and heavy, tapering from the edge into a solid and broad structure above. It was appended to a weighty rod of brass, and the whole hissed as it swung through the air. What benefit to tell of the long, long hours of horror, more than mortal, during which I counted the rushing oscillations of the steel. Inch by inch, line by line, with the descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages. Down and still down it came. I prayed. I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedy descent. Even amid the agonies of that period, the human nature craved food. With painful effort, I outstretched my left arm as far as my bonds permitted, and took possession of the small remnant which had been spared me by the rats. As I put a portion of it within my lips, there rushed to my mind a half-formed thought of joy, of hope. Yet what business had I with hope? It was, as I say, a half-formed thought. I felt that it was of joy, of hope, but felt also that it had perished in its formation. In vain, I struggled to recover, to regain it. Long suffering had nearly annihilated my ordinary powers of mind. Down, still unceasingly, still inevitably down. There suddenly came over my spirit all the keen, collected calmness of despair. For the first time during many hours, or perhaps days, I thought. It now occurred to me that the strapping which enveloped me was unique. I was tied by no separate cord. The first stroke of the razor-like crescent across any portion of the band would so detach it that it might be unwound from my person by means of my left hand. Dreading to find my fate and, as it seemed, my last hope frustrated, I so far elevated my head as to obtain a distinct view of my chest. The strapping enveloped my limbs and body close in all directions, save in the path of the destroying crescent. Scarcely had I dropped my head back into its original position when there flashed upon my mind the unformed half of that idea of deliverance to which I had previously alluded. The whole thought was now present, feeble, scarcely sane, scarcely definite, but still entire. For many hours, the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I lay had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous. Their red eyes glaring upon me as if they waited, but for motionlessness on my part, to make me their prey. What food, I thought, have they been accustomed to in the well? They had devoured, in spite of all my efforts to prevent them, all but a small remnant of the contents of the dish. With the particles of the oily and spicy meat which now remained, I thoroughly rubbed the strapping wherever I could reach it. Then lay breathlessly still. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt at the strapping. This seemed the signal for a general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood. They overran it and leaped in hundreds upon my person. They busied themselves with the anointed bandage. They pressed. They swarmed upon me in ever-accumulating heaps. They writhed upon my throat. Their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. Disgust, for which the world has no name, swelled my chest and chilled with a heavy clamminess my heart. Plainly, I perceived the loosening of my bonds, but the stroke of the pendulum already pressed upon my chest. It had divided the serge of the robe. It had cut through the linen beneath. Sharp sense of pain shot through every nerve, but the moment of escape had arrived. At a wave of my hand, my deliverers hurried tumultuously away. With a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrinking, and slow, I slid from the embrace of the strapping and beyond the reach of the blade. I was free. Free! Free! And in the grasp of the Inquisition. I had scarcely stepped from my wooden bed of horror upon the stone floor of the prison when the motion of the hellish machine ceased, and I beheld it drawn up through the ceiling. Free. I had but escaped death in one form of agony, to be delivered unto worse than death in some other. With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around on the barriers of iron that hemmed me in. Something unusual. Some change had taken place. Even while I breathed, there came to my nostrils the breath of the vapor of heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. There could be no doubt of the design of my tormentors. Oh, most unrelenting. Oh, most demoniac of men. I shrank from the glowing metal to the center of the cell. Amid the thought of the fiery destruction that impended, the idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like balm. I threw my straining vision below. Yet for a wild moment, did my spirits refuse to comprehend the meaning of what I saw. At length, it wrestled its way into my soul. It burned itself in upon my shuddering reason. The heat rapidly increased. There had been a second change in the cell. And now the change was obviously in the form. The inquisitorial vengeance had been hurried by my twofold escape. And there was to be no more dallying with the champion of terrors. The room had been square. In an instant, the cell had shifted its form into that of a lozenge. Death, I said. Any death but that of the pit. Fool! Might I not have known that into the pit was the object of the burning iron to urge me? Flatter and flatter grew the lozenge. The closing walls pressed me resistlessly onward. At length, for my seared and writhing body, there was no longer an inch of foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more. But the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. There was a discordant hum of human voices. There was a loud blast as of many trumpets. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own as I fell fainting into the abyss. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies.